For more on the campaign, we are joined by Labor MP Pat Conroy and in the studio with us, Liberal MP Jason Falinski. Thanks so much for being with us, Pat. Let's just start with you. On Anzac Day, Bill Shorten sort of poo-pooed the idea of a preference deal with Clive Palmer, said that he wasn't the type of person who one should be doing preference deals with and was critical of the Liberal Party for doing one. Now Clive Palmer says that actually Senator Chisholm approached him and called him on Wednesday when he was with Bill Shorten, saying that he'd been with Bill in central Queensland, and he said, is it too late to do a preference deal? Is it good or bad to do a preference deal with Clive Palmer?
Well, let's set the record straight. We've been very clear that we haven't entered into any formal negotiations with Clive Palmer. A phone call from a backbench senator doesn't count as formal negotiations. The facts are these. The Liberals and Scott Morrison have done a preference deal with Clive Palmer, a man who called Scott Morrison Heinrich Himmler, a man who ripped off $70 million from the taxpayers, and a man who ripped off his workers up at the Queensland Nickel Refinery. This is the sort of man Scott Morrison is endorsing by doing a preference deal with Clive Palmer. This is a recipe for more chaos and division, and a vote for the Liberals is a vote for Palmer, and if you want to vote Palmer in the election, you're electing a Liberal Scott Morrison government. So it's an incredibly silly move by the Prime Minister to endorse the actions of a man who's ripped off his own workers and cost taxpayers $70 million. But
would it have been okay if Senator Chisholm had been successful and Labor had done a deal with Clive Palmer?
Well, there were no formal negotiations entered into. A phone call from a backbench senator to Clive Palmer isn't formal negotiations.
Well, he said it's because the senator said that he was with Bill Shorten and that they were there at the same time, and that they'd just been travelling together, and that he was sort of an envoy from Bill Shorten. That was the implication.
Well, Mr. Palmer, and you can draw any implications you want. We've been very clear that we didn't enter into formal negotiations with Clive Palmer. Let's look at the actual facts. The facts are that Scott Morrison has done a dodgy deal with Clive Palmer, a man who still owes $7 million to his workers, a man who forced taxpayers to pick up a $70 million wage bill from Queensland Nickel. This is the sort of man that Scott Morrison wants to put back into Parliament through this dodgy preference deal because he's very desperate. This is a party where 13 of the candidates for Palmer are ex-One Nation candidates. Brian Burston is ex-One Nation. These are extremists that Scott Morrison wants to get into bed with.
OK, Pat, we'll get Jason's take on this. Jason Falinski, are you comfortable with the deal that your party has struck with Clive Palmer?
Well, can I firstly start by saying that I agree with Pat Conroy's criticisms of Clive Palmer. There's no doubt some of those things that he's done are reprehensible. The fact is, though, that in Australian politics at a federal level, we force people to preference people on the ballot paper, even people they don't want to vote for. So both major parties, whether it be Labor or Liberal, are forced to enter into deals with people that they probably wouldn't want to do deals with. But the fact of the matter remains that I'm arguing for a vote, number one, for the Liberal Party. If you want your country to be a better country, if you want a better planet to live in, then I'm encouraging people to vote for the Liberal Party and, preference after that. And I'm sure Pat is arguing for people to vote one for the Labor Party. But the real problem here is the system that we have at a Commonwealth level.
Well, let's look at the comments from former WA Premier Colin Barnett. He sounded warnings yesterday. He wants level heads to prevail. He thinks that given his time of doing a deal with One Nation, which backfired for him, he's warning of a backlash from China as well as the metropolitan seats. Do you agree with that? Doesn't it concern you that these comments have come from such a statesman?
As Colin. Look, I don't agree with Colin on those particular remarks. I think that any particular preference deal you do is going to have problems. I mean, the Labor Party has problems when they do preference deals with the Greens and some other minor parties. I think if Pat were being completely plain speaking here, as I'm trying to be, we'd probably say that, look, the compulsory preferential system we have at a Commonwealth level creates these sorts of problems.
But Jason, isn't part of the problem here slightly different from just doing a deal with someone who might disagree with you philosophically, like One Nation? Because in the people's concerns about Clive Palmer is that he might actually benefit personally from ending up in the Senate, and this preference deal may actually see him end up in the Senate. So, tax cuts for businesses, tax cuts for rich people, the nickel mine, there's a whole panoply of different legislative pushes, which he might actually have the balance of power on, which could benefit his own business and benefit him
And Josh, I
financially.
think the point that I'm hearing you make is a good one, which is that people should take their vote seriously. I mean, they look at a lot of these minor parties and they think, aren't they a lot of fun? The fact of the matter is, as Tony Abbott has said, you should vote for major parties because they have the discipline of actually having to implement the policies that they're putting forward. Some of these minor parties just come up with, I don't know, bubbles, I suppose, and think, oh, that sounds like a lot of fun. So, I mean, really, yeah, we have to take our democracy seriously.
OK, let's move on to another issue that was put firmly on the agenda by the Prime Minister yesterday, which is national security. It's the first time that it has been brought into the debate 2 weeks into the election campaign. Pat, if I can begin with you, Mr Morrison yesterday accused Bill Shorten of holding up this passage of legislation relating to freedom fighters and the power that government may have over them with any returning such freedom fighters. Did the Labor Party drag its feet on this issue?
Absolutely not. This is a desperate and pathetic attempt by Scott Morrison to distract the people from the real issues of this campaign. Let's look at the facts. The facts are that we've supported and worked with the government on many pieces of national security legislation over the last 6 years, but most of them have been flawed, and we've had to move 500 amendments to fix them up before they got through Parliament. On this particular bill, the Parliamentary Joint Intelligence Committee only finished their report on April 3. There was something like 3 sitting days to get it through Parliament, and that report made a significant number of recommendations for amending the bill, recommendations that were bipartisan from both Liberal and Labor members. There was no chance that this bill was going to get through Parliament in the 3 days remaining, in fact 2 days because the Senate were into estimates. There was no chance of getting this bill through Parliament before the election was called. Yet again, the government had dragged their feet on the legislation. If they wanted it through, they should have moved a lot earlier. It was a deeply flawed bill that even Liberal members of the Parliamentary Committee recognised. We've always worked constructively on national security, but this was a pathetic and unprecedented attempt by Scott Morrison to politicise national security, and he should feel deeply ashamed and embarrassed by that action.
What about the desire by the Prime Minister? He's mentioned today that if elected, he wants to see this passed in the first week. Is there any possibility of that if he puts that forward and if they win government?
Well, you're layering hypothetical on top of hypothetical there, but I'll just make the point that we've always worked constructively with the government on national security bills. They have required something like 500 amendments because they're typically rushed in by this chaotic government, but I'm sure if we're in a situation where they're returned, we will work constructively again to ensure that the recommendations from the Joint Intelligence Committee are implemented. But there's a couple of hypotheticals there, and the question has to be put back on Scott Morrison is why didn't he move faster than he did? The issue of returning foreign fighters has been known for a few years now, and he's dragged his feet on this issue.
Jason, let's talk about the substance of this bill. There will be critics who say that this is an attempt to bring national security to the fore because that's where the coalition tends to be on safer ground. Is it reasonable for a person who is an Australian citizen to not be allowed back into the country, even if the reason why they went abroad was not related to terrorism?
Yeah, it's a tough question, Josh. I mean, the fact of the matter is, just to answer partly what Pat said then, the reason this has become so urgent is that it's only been in the last 5 or 6 months that the ISIS has collapsed and their territorial claims in Syria have evaporated. So it means a lot of people who were fighting there who may or may not have been Australians are now seeking to come back. We are not the only country who are facing this problem. The UK is facing this problem. France is facing this problem as well. We have been for about 2 years anticipating this as a problem and trying to work out how the best way to deal with it in a legislative sense is. There are some people who say, to your point, well, we just shouldn't let them back in. We are bound by international law to allow a person who is a citizen of this nation to come back to this country. We're also bound by international law if they are not dual citizens or do not have citizenship of another nation, that we can't make them stateless. That puts us in an invidious position as both a nation and a government. So this piece of legislation was about ensuring that people who come back to this country are appropriately dealt with and monitored in a manner and form so that they can't do harm to our community. Now, the argument that the Prime Minister is making is is that the Labor Party has been slow to this particular debate. It has been difficult to get them across the line on a lot of national security issues. But Bill Shorten today can come out and say, we will support, with the amendments that Pat is talking about that the Joint Security Committee put forward, we will support in the first week of Parliament coming back this piece of legislation to ensure that our community is kept safe.
Just to clarify, we're talking about Australian citizens, so we're not talking about the vast majority of people who were fighters for IS, and we might be even be talking...
The answer is I don't know. Yeah. As I understand it, there were a lot of foreign fighters in that particular conflict. A limited number, you're quite right, the majority were not Australian, but there were a number. Yeah. And we don't actually know. That's the other issue. People may have gone to France and then from France into Syria. It wasn't like people were booking tickets at the airport. You may remember a number of people were stopped leaving the country when it became clear that the security services identified them as heading to Syria.
I don't think anyone would criticise with the desire to make sure that we keep Australia safe and that Australians who do go abroad for whatever reason aren't going to come back and be a threat. But if they are Australian citizens, then isn't there a concern? I mean, would it have been ethical, for example, at the height of the Cold War, to prevent Australian communists from coming back into the country after they'd been abroad?
No, it probably wouldn't have been. And indeed, we had a referendum on that very issue because Menzies tried to ban the Communist Party in Australia. But the question would have been, what measures do you take to ensure the safety of the community?
So why does it have to be...
I think there's a Latin phrase about the great, which you'll actually know, Josh, the highest priority of any government is the safety of its people.
Do you agree, though, with...
I'm just waiting to see if Josh knows.
Yeah, now that you put me up on a pedestal, you're like, oh, he must be a Latin scholar. When am I a Latin scholar,
Caveat emptor, right?
Yeah, exactly. Very good.
That's about it. Just on this very issue, when Scott Morrison raised it yesterday, it prompted Mr Shorten to accuse the government, speaking to Pat's comment just before, of playing political games in the shadow of the shocking Sri Lankan murders.
Yes.
Did you see that? Do you think they have a point when they're saying that?
Well, I don't, is the answer. And knowing the Prime Minister as I do, he would never do that. But the fact of the matter is, in any political campaign and in any governance situation, you need to make points about national security. The Prime Minister made one yesterday. It's up to the voters to decide what they think occurred in that period, but I don't think it invalidates the point that he was making, regardless of what side of the debate what side you fall on that question.
Speaking of debates, Pat, why doesn't Bill Shorten want to have a third debate on the ABC or on a mainstream network with the Prime Minister?
Well, that's not correct. Bill Shorten has said that he's very happy to have a third debate, and he's offered a compromise. What the issue was that we had ABC, Channel 9, a number of other broadcasters wanting the debate, and they couldn't resolve amongst themselves who would do it. So Bill Shorten has offered as a compromise, a sensible one, might I add, for a National Press Club debate,
Pat,
where it could be shared between the ABC and other broadcasters.
Whether we do the debate or whether Channel 9 does the debate. Bill Shorten and the Prime Minister can just decide between themselves who they want to host the debate.
And that's what Bill Shorten has done. Bill Shorten has already agreed to 2 debates. He said if there's a great interest in a third, he's prepared to go to the National Press Club and debate Scott Morrison again, and that feed can be shared by whoever wants it.
Which, though, Pat, is
Bill
not in
Shorten's
prime
made it very
time,
clear that he's prepared to offer a third debate. Well, hold on. You can't say that we should sort it out and then dictate what time it is. That's arguing by sides of the street. Bill Shorten has been very clear that he's happy to have a third debate. He's offered a compromise because the broadcasters couldn't get their act together and agree on what is the appropriate approach, and he's offered a time and date, and it's up to Scott Morrison to match that commitment. We've also offered our shadow ministers to debate the various ministers of the government, and some have accepted, some are running scared, like Melissa Price, who seems to be in witness protection yet again. So we'll see what comes out of this. But Bill Shorten's been running a very open campaign. He's had town halls televised over the last 6 years. I don't think you can accuse this opposition leader of hiding either his policies or being not prepared to debate any time, anywhere.
So just to clarify, the only reason why Bill Shorten is coming up with this solution is because the broadcast networks and the ABC were unable to come to a compromise. But if we presented a united front, then he'd do it?
Well, Well, Bill Shorten made it very clear that the stumbling block to agreeing to a third debate was that there was multiple offers out there from different broadcasters. And so he's proposed a compromise to ensure that we get a third debate. I think that's a reasonable and sensible approach from a man who's been incredibly open and accessible during the 6 years he's been opposition leader. Like, there's a huge amount of hypocrisy from the Liberals on this. This is a government that shut down Parliament early to avoid debate, that it has been in hiding, that it has ministers in witness protection. So I think it's a bit rich from the Liberal Party to go on the offensive over this, aided and abetted by some journalists who aren't getting exactly what they want.
Jason, to draw on Pat's point there on senior ministers, that we haven't really seen much throughout this campaign, the Environment Minister being one of them, perhaps critics say the Energy Minister as well. Why aren't we seeing more of your high-profile cabinet members out there on the hustings?
I think only because the nature of modern political campaigning is that they are presidential in style and nature. I'm disappointed Pat used the witness protection line, because I was going to say that about Chris Bowen, but anyway, he got him first. So look, you know, I understand that Pat wants to see more of Melissa and Angus Taylor. We'd love to see more of Chris Bowen, but in the end, Australians will need to be deciding between Labor and the Liberal Party, and Bill Shorten as Prime Minister or Scott Morrison as Prime Minister.
Just on Melissa Price, after that groundwater deal was approved at Adani,
yep.
Has we not seen much of her because of that?
No, I don't think so. I just think that Melissa's in Western Australia. I think she's got an electorate the size of Western Europe. It's one of the largest electorates in the world, and she's, you know, obviously trying to get across of much of that as possible.
She has to physically traverse the entire electorate.
So that's what I thought too.
Week.
Well, that's what I thought
It's
too.
the size of Western Europe. That's not as populous as Western Europe.
No, it's not as populous, but every town with about 30 or 40 people wants to see their local member. So, yeah, she's done more kilometres than I think you and I will do in our lifetime, Josh. Unless we get to fly to the move.
Look, when I go to Italy for my Latin classes,
yes.
I rack up a lot of miles.
That's true.
I know nothing about
I know. I once saw your frequent flyer account in my...
Thank you, Jason.
No, thank you, Josh.
Thanks for joining us, gentlemen.
Liberal MP, and thanks also to Pat Conroy, Labor MP.